Good evening. I welcome you all to this weekly webinar sessions of Upskill, which is being organized by PG Subspecialty Section of Indian Psychiatric Society. In fact, today is our seventh session, and today we have got one important topic because during our PG days, most of us, we often face a problem when to write the thesis protocol. And to have this, we have got a very eminent speaker. But before moving into today's proceeding, as per our tradition, let us announce the results of the best question being asked in the last session. It was Sadanand Reddy. And if he is here, I would like to request him kindly to write his address as well as the phone number in the chat box so that we can send him the surprise gift, which contains a certificate and a book. So without any further delay, now may I request Gurinder Veer Singh to introduce our speaker, Dr. Samir Kumar Paharaj. Gurinder.
Wishing you all a very good evening. Dr. Samir Kumar Paharaj, the man of the hour, as you all are aware of, is a name in our community itself, and he needs no introduction. We are hereby highlighting few facts about his background. Dr. Samir Kumar Paharaj graduated from Guwahati Medical College and then pursued his DPM and MD from Central Institute of Psychiatry, Ranchi. He is GSMC Fellow and DBT India Alliance Fellow. Respected sir is currently serving as a professor and head Department of Psychiatry and as a coordinator Clinical Research Center for Neuromodulation in Psychiatry, Kasturba Medical College, Manipal. His main areas of interest happens to be clinical psychopharmacology, developmental psychopathology, drug de-addiction, bipolar disorder, brain stimulation techniques, including transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation, cognitive behavioral therapy, psychiatric education and medical education. He is Chief Associate Editor of Indian Journal of Psychosocial Medicine and is also the lead psychiatrist in ICBT project for tinnitus in Indian population. He has various publications in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters. Apart from his ongoing major contributions in the field of psychiatry, there is a list of awards to his name. We are naming few: Best Resident Award, CIP Ranchi 2007, ISBD 2008, Travel Award for Early Career Psychiatrist, Professor Raghuram Distinguished Young Teacher Award 2016. Now, without any further ado, let's begin with the topic. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'll just share my screen and then we'll start. I think people will keep joining. But we'll just start. This is not a lecture, so I'll not be giving some points, that way. Rather, what I'll be doing is next 40-45 minutes, I'll be sharing some of my experiences and maybe giving some ideas, basically, how to go about it. I know this topic is something which is basically relevant for someone who has joined a program. Let's say you've started, joined MD program or maybe even DPM. In some places, they have dissertations for DPM students as well as those who have joined, let's say, PhD courses. There's a slight difference. When someone joins a PhD course, possibly they will have some idea about the topic. They would have thought about it. MD, DNB, and DPM courses, usually they're fresh. I mean, MBBS, we know. I mean, there are not a lot of things that are taught related to research, related to planning. So many are at loss regarding that. Let's say within 3 months, 4 months of joining, they are asked to come up with their protocol because that need to be registered so that you finish on time. So, and there is a deadline for submitting the thesis as well. So before the exam, final exam, before 6 months is what is mandated by NMC. So yes, I mean, people rush around and then maybe try to find out the topic. But I think what I'll try to do is I'll try to bring out some of those aspects in subsequent, let's say, next half an hour or so. So this is what I'll be covering basically. So some things regarding the supervisor, the guides, what kind of topic, what kind of research question. I think this was supposed to be a separate presentation altogether. I think that was skipped for some reason. Probably it will happen at some other point of time. So still I'll touch upon a little bit in this particular area. Literature search, I think you had a session last week. So I'll not go deep into the literature search in general per se, but I'll be specific about what exactly to search when you're thinking about a topic, when you're writing the protocol. And of course, we'll go through the protocol format, the standard format, a little bit about guidelines, a little bit about other things like plagiarism, ethics committee, CTRA registration. So those things we'll discuss. Okay. So feel free to stop me if you want to ask any question, or you can put in the chat box. If you don't want to ask now, you can put in the chat box. We can discuss in the end also. So both are fine. So we'll start with the supervisor. So now, many a times what happens when we are joining a particular course, usually the guides are allotted by the college. I mean, the HOD maybe would prepare a list. There are PhD guides and MD guides, and depending on who is, let's say, who all are eligible and the number of students, they would divide and they would allot guides. So that is the usual process. So you don't get to choose actually, but is it possible? I mean, can you actually choose your guides? So some places it is possible. Specifically, if there is some flexibility in the department, you can actually think about choosing your guide. And this is definitely the scenario when you are doing your PhD, because usually the PhD students get an opportunity to choose their guide as well. The same holds for the guide as well. The guide also chooses the student. Essentially, how do you choose your guide? This is possible if you have a specific idea in your mind, and you know that that particular idea, that particular research project can be done well with under a particular supervisor. So in that case, it's possible to choose your guide. Otherwise, most of the MD DNB courses, it's fixed, it is allotted all in. But what you can do, so why basically you need a guide? It's mandated by NMC. So, but that's not the just one thing. Guides actually go they're supposed to do a lot more than just being there on paper. Maybe they are actually supposed to guide you. They're actually going to supervise you. So I mean, if you really get a good guide or good supervisor who understands the needs and the requirements of the student, so nothing like it. So many a times you need to try to fit into that role. So when you find your guide, so maybe you need to understand the guide's temperament, and then the guide also has to do the same. Maybe understand the student's temperament, and thereby they form a relationship which will continue for next maybe 2 years or 3 years. So that is something which is essential for a good research, because otherwise you'll end up with something which is more like a formality. You just do a research just for the sake of doing it. Many a times what will happen is, let's say if you are working on a particular area, the guide may have expertise in one area, but may not have expertise in some other field, maybe. And you want to do a research, work on a particular area, which involves, let's say, more than 2 disciplines. Let's say, for example, you want to do a study which involves, let's say, inputs from a psychiatry field, as well as someone who is from basic sciences. Let's say you want to do something related to, let's say, basic physiology or basic biochemistry. So it's always a good idea to have co-guides. So you need to choose experts in that particular field. So that way you'll get good input from both your guide and as well as co-guide, and that will help in let's say carrying out a research in a better way. So there is always an option for co-guides. I mean, how many people, how many students a guide can actually supervise is something that is fixed by NMC. But co-guides, there is no limit to that. You can have more than 1 or 2 co-guides. Even if there is a limitation on co-guides, you can have people as experts who essentially give inputs. And this is something which is very relevant if you're doing your PhD. So PhD, you should always look for experts in the field. So it's not just possible for the guide to have expertise in many different areas. So in PhD, it is almost a must. You should have experts. And experts need not be only from the same institutes. Same way, the co-guides need not be from the same institute. You can choose a co-guide from some other institute as well. And nowadays, if you see, collaborative research is something which is being promoted by most of the institutions, and they will always recognize that. They will always encourage that. Why? Because through collaborative research, you can achieve something which is not possible if you're just sticking to your institute. So if it is possible, you can always ask for expertise, outside expertise also. It can even go up to, let's say, not only experts inside our country, but maybe we can get some inputs from even international experts. So that will all depend on your guide as well, because the guide is a person who can actually, they will have a lot of contacts, and they can actually, let's say, talk to people who are experts in that particular field, maybe from other countries also, and you can get necessary inputs. The other thing that I said is one thing that the students should learn quickly, because like I said, all persons are different, so all the guides will be also different. So the temperaments will be very different. And if you're not able to cope with your guides, your next 3 years is going to be really bad. So that is something that you need to learn early. It's not to say that you have to always please your guide or something like that, but then see how to get the best out of this relationship. Actually, if you see, there is something called mentor and mentee. This is not the same as, let's say, the guide and student relationship. It's something much more than that. Now, who is called a mentor, basically? So mentor is actually someone who not only just tells you about the subject, but it's a much wider term that is used. So it's not just restricted to the topic, the thesis topic or something that way. So they actually try to understand you as a person. They will try to understand your aspirations, your vision, your ideas, and try to nurture that. So they'll be looking at all different aspects of this, all your strengths, and how to make the best out of that particular, let's say, candidate. So that is someone who is called a mentor. So it's very difficult actually to have a mentor-mentee relationship always. But yeah, it's sometimes possible. I mean, if you have a very good supervisor, probably you can nurture this particular relationship. And this relationship doesn't end with, let's say, when you finish your, let's say, MD, you do your thesis, go out of the college, it doesn't end there. So probably it will continue later also. So probably you will continue to have that kind of relationship, which started with, let's say, during your MD days or your DNB days, but then that continues later also, maybe years together. When the mentor actually continues to see whether the mentee actually learns more, let's say, gets into the research, okay, more, and then maybe they can help in, let's say, supervising when they're out of their courses. They may actually may help in securing grants, and maybe help in, may sometimes later even collaborate with you. So that's the kind of relationship that is something which is ideal, but it doesn't happen often, but you should always strive for that. Okay. Okay, once, let's say, you have identified your guide, your supervisor, and then the next thing is, you'll have to choose a topic. And I think this is what I would say is one of the most difficult part of, let's say, what we're discussing today. Let's say, writing a thesis protocol. The most difficult part is identifying the topic, the research question. If you do this, 50% of your work is over. Now, many times people will have this idea in their mind already. Like I said, when someone is starting, let's say, PhD, they'll have some idea about which area they want to work, because based on that only they choose their guides. But in other fields, it is little bit difficult. Many will not have that idea. So I'll just try to give you different ways, and I'll give one or two examples also. So if you already have an idea, nothing like it. I understand. I mean, when someone is doing, I'll give my example. When I joined the DPM course, before DPM, during MBBS, we hardly knew anything about research. So we, in those days, actually, we didn't have. Now, at least, people are getting into research even during UG days. I mean, you have something like STS that is given by ICMR. So people have some idea about research and how to write a protocol, how to do research in general. But in those days, it was not there. So when DPM, even I was clueless about what to do. And I was looking at different places. And then but when I joined MD, because I already, during DPM, we had to do a dissertation. So during MD, I had that idea. I had some experience about doing research. So when I joined MD, I came with the idea that this is exactly what I'm going to do. So that time something, this TMS was something which was upcoming. So I thought about it when I joined MD. So in that case, it becomes very easy, but this will not be something that will happen with many. So what are the other ways in which you can look up? The other thing is, if your guide is really dedicated and they are into a lot of research, they would have thought about a particular topic. So again, you don't have to do much. You just follow whatever guide. If you are okay with the idea, you can proceed with that. Again, that happens not very often, but yes, I mean, some good supervisors, they will always have a very clear plan of plan in their mind. Okay. The other areas which actually you should be, let's say, looking into to get an idea about which topic to work on is something that you get from the clinical problems. So if you pay little attention, because after joining, maybe you're supposed to come up with your protocol maybe within 3 months. So you would have some idea about what are the common clinical problems that you see. And people will be discussing in rounds and other places about how a particular area, we don't have any answer, a clear answer. So if you see something that way, if something fancies your mind, maybe you can pick that one up and then maybe you can proceed. So from bedside, you can think about some of these research topics. The other sources would be, let's say, ask your seniors. Suppose your seniors, those who are already into second year, third year, or maybe doing senior residency, they would be having some ideas because they would have done or they would be doing some amount of research, and they can tell you about areas which they wanted to do, they couldn't do, or they had planned some way. So that is another source which you'll get. Sometimes even colleagues, I mean, because you would be, let's say, going through 3-4 ideas, and then you choose one particular topic. The other topic which is open, you can always share with your friends. So that is another source that you can get. Even patients sometimes they come up with some ideas. So I've had patients actually who ask, I mean, why this particular area is I mean, no one has done something about it, and then you get an idea. Okay, yeah, we should be doing something. So that is another source that you can say. Another common source that I would suggest is attending conferences. It's a very good idea actually in the initial part when you join a course to attend the conferences in that field. And what will happen is, I'm telling about attending conference, not just going there and then maybe going out to visit places. If you actually listen to the presentations, you will see they will pick up some ideas, no, some things that need to be studied further. And these are some things if we can note down and you can come and discuss with your guide, maybe you'll get a lot of ideas. So this is something that I used to do in the early days. So I would jot down, let's say, quick points, which I can later come back and think about it and see if I can do some research on those areas. So that is another source. Of course, I mean, you need to get into literature and then see what all studies have been done in particular area. So I'll tell a little bit more about that. So recent publications in specific areas, if you look at, go through the papers and then see the limitations and future directions, you'll get some idea about which topic to work on. So critical appraisal of papers. This is little difficult for a new person, maybe, but maybe for old, let's say, someone who is doing PhD, or maybe for young faculty. So this is something which is actually a source of. So if you appraise the papers really well, not only you learn about that particular area, learn how to, let's say, improve in your research abilities, you also get new ideas. So this is something that you should be doing at least at later part of your, let's say, second year, third year MD, you start doing this. And of course, once you are into senior residency and in your junior faculty level, you should always be doing critical appraisal of papers, at least with at some interval. Let's say at least 1 or 2 papers in a month. And actually, if you're doing this, you should be also writing letter to editor and then trying to publish it, which actually develops your skills of research as well as thinking about new topics. And once you think of new topics, you can suggest this to your students, or you can yourself think about doing research in that particular field. Other things which are actually more theoretical, I would say, I mean, societal priorities. I don't know how many of us actually think about societal priorities. So something which is now, I think COVID people are talking about. So if you think about a topic in COVID, so that would be more like a priority demanded by the society. We don't think about this actually often, but then, yeah, that's a good thing, because then it will be recognized by people, others. Even funding agencies. So if you are looking for funding, you should look at which area they want, the funding agencies want the research to be. Specifically when you are doing any research which will involve some amount of money, because I doubt whether most of the colleges will be giving more than 10,000, 20,000 rupees for MD thesis. And it's not just possible to do a lot of biological research unless you are in a government institute and everything is being provided by the institution. So you need some amount of funding. So especially funding agencies for PG research would be like ICMR, who regularly they give. It's not big amount, but then it will cover some basic investigations. So you need to look at which areas funding agencies actually focus on. So if you look at that and try to match your, let's say, topic with that, likely that you will get funding also. So these are some of the ways in which you can think about a good research topic. Otherwise, maybe sometimes we want to extend some findings from basic sciences. So there's a lot of literature on basic sciences which need to be translated into clinical practice. So, and there's a huge gap actually between, if you see the basic sciences research has gone to a lot, there's a lot of advancement there, but it has not actually translated into clinical practices. So if you want to bridge that gap, this is again another area in which many funding agencies will be actually happy to sponsor if you're trying to translate something into clinical practice. But again, these are a little bit tricky, little bit difficult. Most of the research actually, whenever you are thinking about a topic, it won't be something which is very novel. I understand. I mean, there will be limitation of what you can do as a beginner. What we say is most of the people who will be doing research, the students will be doing research, will be what we call incremental research. Because there is something already known about a particular topic, you need to advance it a little bit more. So that is what you should aim at. But of course, if you have a very great idea, nothing like it. Okay. Now, how do you do a literature search if you want to look into the literature and then see, okay, this is the topic that I want to work on. So how do you narrow down that? So one thing that you can think of is a very broad area. Okay, I want to do some research in, let's say, psychosis, or let's say in schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So that big broad topic you can think of. So once you think about that and then maybe look into that particular topic, you do a very specific PubMed search. Let's say very basic PubMed search using that particular and that particular keyword, and maybe the recent publications. Let's say schizophrenia 2021. So if you do that research, that particular search, you'll see what are the recent publications. So in 2021, what are the areas that have been targeted in schizophrenia? So if you'll get a fairly good idea about the range of topics that has been researched in 2021. So if something is striking, let's say a particular idea strikes you, let's say you think about a particular area, particular research area in schizophrenia that you thought is something very interesting and you want to look more into that. So how do you go about it? So the first thing that you do is you do a systematic look for systematic reviews in that particular topic. Again, so schizophrenia, let's say you want to say schizophrenia, antipsychotics, systematic reviews. So if you use AND operator and then see schizophrenia, antipsychotic, systematic reviews. So you'll see all the systematic reviews that have been done in that particular area. So what will happen is systematic reviews basically are, as you know, I mean, they're systematically reviewed all the published literature in that particular area. So in just, if you get, let's say 1 or 2, or there will be some areas in which you may have 5, 6 systematic reviews, but I don't think you'll have more than that. There are some areas in which you may not find any. But if you're lucky enough to find, let's say 1 or 2 systematic reviews, your job is actually much easier. And specifically, if the review has been done recently. So let's say you get a systematic review done in 2020. So you will get an idea about almost all the research that is done in that particular area. And they would have actually, if it is a very good systematic review done by a credible organization or body, you'll have a very filtered kind of information, which is very useful. So it's very easy to then choose your topic if you get a systematic review, very well done systematic review. And you just see what all studies have been done, what are the shortcomings, what are the major findings, what are the drawbacks in those studies. And invariably, they would have suggested something that need to be done. So this particular area has not been researched well, this is to be done. So they would mention, and you straight away dive into that. So then you are really lucky. So if you get something like that. So if you find something that way, any shortcoming that is mentioned in a systematic review, take that one as a more of a researchable question. So researchable question is something in which a research can be done. So you can have many different questions. So, but all questions, it's very difficult to actually do a research and study specifically as part of your MD thesis or PhD. So it should be a researchable question, something that can be done. So that is, I'll come to that one, what kind of questions you should think of. Now, if you don't get a systematic review, then there is a problem. Then you need to look into what are the individual studies. So you may have to rely on RCTs or let's say even observational studies. And maybe you need to, let's say you may have to go through, let's say 15, 20 papers then and actually filter out information on your own. And again, look into the drawbacks and then try to find out what would be a good question. So once you do that, once you narrow down on particular researchable question, the next thing that you need to do is you need to think what class of research question is this? Is this a research question about, let's say, um, uh, whether this particular thing is a risk factor of something, whether this is an intervention that you need to do, whether you want to look into, let's say, what is the prevalence or incidence rates, or do you want to, let's say, see whether it can predict something, or do you want to see something like it's a diagnostic information which will help you in making a diagnosis. So if you there are broad types of research questions. So if you identify which class of research question, so the actual design, study design is very easy. So many times what happens is when you're actually thinking of writing a protocol, the first thing that you, okay, I'll take schizophrenia, I'll take control, I'll apply these 2 scales, and then I'll write a protocol. Then you start thinking about what kind of research design you'll have. Rather, it should be the other way around. If you identify the research question properly, the method, everything follows that one. So what kind of research design, what are the tools, how you are going to go about it, will all follow that particular question. So this is a very common mistake people make. Rather than spending time on identifying the research question, they spend time on identifying the research design and the variables and the disorder, which is not the right approach. So that is something we need to change. So over a period of time, we'll learn how to identify a research question first, followed by what kind of research you are going to do, what kind of design you are going to take. Okay, so once you identify which class of research question, whether it is a descriptive kind, intervention, or something diagnostic, predictive, once you think about that way, then you need to write it in a very clear term. Okay, what we call PICO elements. I'll tell a little bit more about PICO elements. So there are 2 things that you can remember if you are talking about, let's say, good research question. So there's something what we call finer criteria that whenever you thought about a research question, see whether it is fitting into this finer criteria or not. So thinking about a very good research topic is nice, but then you should also understand that it should be feasible. So how do you know whether it is feasible or not? So whether you have the kind of patients, let's say you are thinking about doing a study on a particular population, that population doesn't come to your hospital. I want to do a study on eating disorders because that's a fancy topic. But then I go and see in OPD, I don't see eating disorder patients. They don't come to us. So it's not feasible. Okay, so it's not a very good idea to choose a topic in which you don't have the subjects. Same way, you're thinking about, okay, I'll do a quantitative EEG study, and no one in your department knows how to do a quantitative EEG study. You can take expertise from outside, but if it is not available locally, so it's not a very good idea. Similarly, you want to think about, let's say, I will do some genetic study, but you don't have money. Okay, you don't get grant, so you cannot do it. So that way, you have to think whether it's a feasible thing or not. And second thing is it should be interesting. So interesting basically means it just don't interest you. I mean, I'll think about let's say doing a research in a very obscure topic. Why do people scratch their nose? I don't know. It is interesting to me, but people may not be interested in knowing about that particular topic. So think about that particular topic which may interest others, interest your colleagues, your other investigators, others in the community. So that's how interesting topic could be. Novel, of course, I mean, this is something which everyone wants to do, something new, something. But many times we'll not be able to do something very novel, but sometimes we can just replicate or do a little bit which extends the previous findings. So that's also fine. That doesn't matter. The other thing is, this is something very important. What we need to understand is whether the study is ethical or not. One is ethical, of course. I mean, whether it is ethical or not, you send your protocol to your ethics committee. If you have a very good ethics committee, you will get a lot of feedback, and then you can improve on your design. There are other ways in which the study can be unethical. In the sense, there is already a very robust answer to a particular question which is available in the literature, and you just want to replicate it. It's a very well-known finding, but you still want to do something the same. It's not ethical. So you're just exposing patients to unnecessary research. So that's also unethical. So what is ethical, what is unethical in research actually is quite, that itself is a big topic. So I would suggest, I mean, you should go through ICMR guidelines for ethical research, which basically lists most of these things. And of course, what is relevant? So relevant in terms of the clinical practice, or in terms of, let's say, improving the scientific, advancing scientific knowledge. So these are the criteria. If you keep in mind, see, all the questions that you will choose may not fit into the final criteria. It doesn't matter. You see that most of it actually is fulfilled. So once you do that, then you need to write down your, let's say, research question in a very specific term. So that is what we call the study objectives. And in some cases, you may have to write a hypothesis. So write the study objectives in PICO's terms. So PICO's means basically, P is the population, which population. Let's say you want to study something in schizophrenia population. So schizophrenia becomes your patient population. I is intervention, or sometimes in for observational studies, it will be E, that is exposure. So what is the intervention, or what is the exposure? So that is the other thing that you need to define in the objective. C is the comparison group. So that may be relevant in some study designs in which there is an intervention. And O is the outcome. So this is very important. So what is the outcome measure? So that you need to, so these four things should always be part of your definition of your the study objectives. And the same thing gets reflected in the hypothesis. Some designs you may have to mention about the time also. Let's say 6 months follow-up or 2 months follow-up. So that way, so time also will come. Now this PICO design is something, this is something very basic, but many times if you see even published literature also, you will see these elements are missing in the objectives that are mentioned in published papers also. So most of the good journals will not agree to these papers, but then, I mean, you know, there are a lot of journals which may publish this material. Okay, now let's go to the protocol format. So let's say if you have identified your research question and you are ready, I think, like I said, no, if you do this, you're already, you have done half of the task. Rest, everything will fall into place. So I'll just tell a little bit about what are the other things that are important. So this is a protocol format. So we'll go one by one. We'll see some of these things. So maybe title page, you need to write the title of the study, the researcher, supervisors, affiliation, those things. So introduction part, basically it tells you about the need for the study, aim, objective, hypothesis, you need to mention, material and methods, the study design, what design, this is very important actually. Many people don't write the design. So the basic design elements, no, whether it's experimental or observational, qualitative, quantitative. So those kind of things at least you should write. The study sample, how it is chosen, how their sample size calculations, the outcomes need to specify, you may have to define it, the tools, details about the tools, procedure, analysis, I'll come to those things a little bit, and other things like ethical considerations, implications. So essentially, if you do the study, what are the findings that you are going to get? So that are basically, those are basically implications. So you need to say that, okay, if I do this, I may get this, I'm expecting this, and then those will be the implications that you need to write, not a lot of details, references, data sheets, and then a little bit about timeline. I'll just go one by one, I'll tell. So what exactly you need to write in the introduction part. So essentially, when you start writing the introduction, you start with a very broad area, narrow down gradually. So start with, let's say, if you are talking about a very specific area in schizophrenia, so start with broad topic, that's schizophrenia itself, and then maybe one paragraph, and then maybe go down, narrow down, and go to your specific topic. In that specific topic that you have identified, so what is known in that particular topic, that should be mentioned. So you don't have to do a very thorough literature search, literature review here. So maybe a few important studies, or maybe a systematic review if you have found that. And what are the limitations of the previous research? That is something that you need to write here. So after what you write, like what is known in this particular area, you write what is the research gap, what is not known, and that becomes your need for the study. So this is the gap, and my study objectives will try to fill this particular gap. So that's how you write your introduction. And like I said, in protocols, it is not a comprehensive review of literature that we'll be doing later. So don't write all the studies and then keep describing. So that's not part of, let's say, protocol introduction. So write only key studies or a systematic review. So that should be good enough. Next important thing is specifically write the aims and objectives. Has to be defined in very clear terms. And the so aims and objectives and the methods part is the most important part in the protocol writing. So so what is aim and what is objective? Aim is actually a very broad thing. So if you have you may have multiple objectives, but you have only a single aim. Usually, most of the research will have a single aim. So it should be very broad aim that you should be writing, and the objective should be very specific. And it's a very good idea to have a primary objective, and you can have multiple objectives, and others become secondary objective. So this is very important because all your calculations, sample size, and everything will depend on the primary objective. Even the outcomes also will be basically based on the primary objective. So many times you specify multiple objectives without identifying which one is the primary one. And some study designs, you may have hypothesis. So hypotheses are nothing but basically the objectives written in a different way. Let's say you can write in as a null hypothesis. Let's say if you say that, okay, there will be a difference between these patients and controls on a particular measure, you make a null hypothesis that so there will be no difference between these two groups on that particular measure. So that's a null hypothesis. Or you can write an alternative hypothesis also. I mean, nowadays it's accepted, but specifically if there is some literature to support alternate hypothesis, you can say, okay, so the patient group will score more on this particular area as compared to controls. So that would be alternate hypothesis. So either of them is fine. So no need to write both. And there can be other designs as well. There can be studies in which you need not write a hypothesis, specifically when you are doing exploratory study. So that particular area has not been studied before. So most of the studies you can broadly categorize as exploratory and confirmatory. So exploratory studies as the one in which there is nothing there out there in the literature, and you want to look into many different variables. So in many of the studies you'll see, like you'll try to correlate with all sociodemographic variables. You will examine many different variables across groups. So those things can be exploratory. So you need not have specific hypothesis then. There is no point in having a hypothesis. There is a difference. If you mention it is exploratory study, then you need not actually correct for multiple testing. So this is something that you can keep in mind. Whereas if you say it is a confirmatory study, you are having a hypothesis, then you should be mindful about how many tests you are doing, how many hypothesis testing you are doing. So you cannot just go on doing, let's say 10, 20, 30 hypothesis testing without correcting, because that will give rise to many false positive findings. The other thing that you can keep in mind, so this is SMART goals is something that we talk about. I mean, for objectives also you can think about being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. So SMART objectives you can think about. Or you can have a different design altogether. You can have a qualitative design which has nothing to do with hypothesis. So that is another way. So some things you may need to just look into. So you need to do a qualitative study. Okay, so this is in a nutshell what exactly should be written under methods. So you can say, like I said, whether it's exploratory study or descriptive hypothesis testing, what kind of population you are analyzing, whether you are analyzing individuals or something else. What kind of investigation that you are doing? Are you comparing two groups? Are you seeing relationship? So that will keep your idea. It should be very clear, like what kind of analysis you want to do, what kind of sampling you are doing. Are you doing a probability sampling or a non-probability sampling? So whether it's experimental study or an observational study, whether it is a cross-sectional study or a longitudinal study, whether you have planned something in a particular setting, or because patients are coming to the hospital you are taking, so that way. And what are the outcome measures, how you are categorizing, how you are actually measuring, what tools you are using, questionnaires, and how you are planning to do the data analysis, whether you want to just explore the data, want to see, test any hypothesis. So all these things should be part of your method section. And this is, like I said, the most important part. I'll just touch upon some of the things. So sampling, like I said, you'll have to be very specific which sampling method you are using. So most of the times in hospital setting, you'll be using something like purposive or convenience kind of sampling. But you need to be specific about that. And sample size estimate. So this is just one example. So there are simple softwares which are available, which you can use to calculate. But I think many times, if you don't understand, you take the help of a statistician early regarding sample size estimation. It's not a good idea to do the study and then say, okay, my sample was very small, so I cannot generalize the findings. So that's not a very good study idea. So you should discuss about this with your statistician. And many times, if you don't have a statistician, also you can take help of your seniors or your guide. So they'll be able to tell you so how to estimate sample size. Eligibility criteria should be very specifically written, inclusion, exclusion criteria. If you see in this example, so diagnosis of bipolar disorder as per DSM-5, age range, so 5 years of formal education. Exclusion criteria, if you see psychotic disorder, organic causes, substance use. If you see, I'm not actually very specific. So I'm not saying which psychotic disorder, what organic causes. So you should be actually more specific than this. So you can say psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia, delusional disorder as per DSM-5 or something that way. And again, if you see age 18 to 60 years, inclusion criteria I have written, and then exclusion also I have written. Age less than 18 years, more than 60 years, just a repetition. So these are common mistakes that you make when you write eligibility criteria. So you need to be a little bit mindful about this kind of mistakes. Now the tools and the measurements, questionnaires. So you need to prepare a data set. So many times it's something new. I mean, because if you have not done it before, what you can do is you can go back and see previous thesis, maybe in the appendices, you'll find the data sets, or in the papers also, when you are doing a, let's say you have reviewed some literature, you would see, like the table 1, the sample characteristics. What are the things that have been documented? So what are the things that are important? Why this is important is basically people have done thesis dissertations, they have not collected basic demographic and clinical data, and papers get rejected later when you start sending for publications. So if you're collecting more information in the beginning, it's always good to have a very detailed data set or a proforma. Even if you're not using some of these for analysis, that's fine. But when you are actually planning a study, have a very detailed data set. So this is something that I learned from my mistakes. So I have seen people, their papers getting rejected because they have not collected basic information, basic data, although the studies are very good. The questionnaires and scales, you need to be very specific about which version of the scale or instrument that you're using, how many items, how the rating is being done in that, how scorings are done, interpretation of the findings, the psychometric properties, reliability, validity, so those measures. So there's some things that we need to understand is many of the scales will not be in our native languages. So you need to pay attention to that. The objective scales are fine. I mean, you can administer in your language and then you can still score them. But there are many subjective questionnaire scales which is need to be translated, validated, and it's not just enough to write psychometric properties of the original scales. You are supposed to actually identify the psychometric properties in your population. Many times it will not be available, so you may have to go through translation validation. I'll tell a little bit more about that. Similarly, devices, what kind of devices you're using, the brands, versions, settings, how they are used. So those details should be written. The other important elements in this is the study endpoints. So you can have primary endpoints, you can have secondary endpoints. So the primary outcome is something which is very important, like I said, no, because all your the major hypothesis will be based on the primary outcome, and your whole sample size calculation, the study will be powered to actually identify differences in the primary outcome. So that is the importance of the primary outcome. You can have multiple secondary outcomes, there is no problem, but don't have more than two primary outcomes. Usually one is preferred, but sometimes you can have two primary outcomes, but don't have 4 or 5 primary outcomes. That is basically a sort of mindless kind of research. The other thing is relevance, whether that particular outcome is relevant or not. So is it meaningful? Does it have some clinical translation? You cannot just think about, okay, I am teaching a particular skill and the outcome is what you have learned in that skill. So let's say in today's presentation, if I keep outcome as so some slide, some content that you have learned. So that is not an endpoint actually. So the outcome should be whether you are able to write a good protocol or not. So that would be a good outcome rather than just checking knowledge at the end of the session, that whether you have remembered 1 or 2 things that I've said. So that's not a good outcome. So it should be relevant. It should have some meaning, and it should be very clearly stated. So outcomes sometimes need to be defined, and you need to again go back to the literature, see how it has been defined and which definition you are going to use in your study. Sometimes it's a very good idea actually to identify confounders early. This is a little bit tricky because many a times when you are new to research, you may not know, but maybe your seniors or your guides, they should be able to tell you what could be the possible confounders. So think in a way like this particular outcome, what else can actually influence that outcome? And you will list maybe 10 things. Out of that, maybe 1 or 2 things you can control, you can identify. There are many things that's beyond your control. So that's fine. But identifying that one is a very good idea. So some things at planning stage you can control. There are some things that you can control during your statistical analysis. Okay, so now let's say if you're doing an intervention, or so you need to describe those things in detail. Let's say what goes into active, let's say treatment, what goes into the SAM treatment. So describe in detail. So if it's a drug, what kind of dose, how frequently you are increasing the dose, and then what route you are giving. All those details should be there. Any therapy, you need to write about those details. So similarly, if there is any randomization, blinding, so those things need to be described in detail, how it is to be done. So it's a very good idea. I mean, if you have let's say you have 5 sessions to describe. So session 1, session 2, session 3, 4, 5. So you can use a table to, so it's a good idea to summarize the interventions. Then you need to write about the procedure, how exactly you are going to approach the participants. So you described the study sample, but how are you going to advertise somewhere? Are you going to put it on the website or put it on social media? Need to be very specific. You need to specify all these things in the protocol itself. And about the information sheet, so what are you going to tell your participants? Is it a hard copy or a soft copy that will be mailing them? How are you going to take informed consent? So what are the study questionnaires? So how are you going to give it to them? So what form? So when are you going to follow them up? Is it just one-time assessment or there are multiple assessments? All those things should be part of your procedure, description of procedure. Then the analysis plan. So you need to tell about which software you are going to use, how are you going to summarize your findings, how are you going to check your assumptions, what are the statistical tests that you are going to do. This is very important. So because let's say you don't write these things in the beginning, and then once you see the data, you see, okay, this particular test, I'm not getting a positive value. So positive means p less than 0.05. So I'll do another test. That is something which you should not be doing. It has to be specified in the protocol. And many of the protocols, even we used to do that, but then now we learned about this. You should not be writing that appropriate statistical test to be done. So that's not a right way of writing analysis plan. You should specify, okay, there are two groups. For comparison, I'll be using a t-test. So specify that. Right, which measures you will be describing, effect size measures. What are the p-value cutoffs? Are you going to take a cutoff of p less than 0.05, or you are doing multiple tests, so you are making it more stringent? You want to keep it p less than 0.001, or what corrections are you going to do? All these things should be specified in the analysis plan. Similarly, if you are having a qualitative design, so which qualitative approach, which qualitative analysis you are using, and how are you going to ensure the data quality? So there are many ways to ensure data quality in qualitative designs. So those things you need to specify in the analysis plan. You should always look into this kind of charts, algorithms to describe the study flow. So how participants, they will be recruiting, how patients who are getting excluded, all those details you can write in this way. Some information, it is very easy to write in graphical form. If you read the text, it's so, I mean, you describe it, but then if you put a picture, it becomes very clear. So that way. So so sometimes you may use graphs like this to depict your design. Also, like I said, you tell about the expected outcome. So what are the findings which are expected, and try discussing in your protocol. And put the references. This is another important thing you learn as you are doing your thesis, how to write your references. There are many software which are available, and I'll tell you, I mean, many of the softwares actually come up with very wrong kind of references. So you should always cross-check manually. This is important when you're submitting for your papers. So if you start doing it early, learning it early, it's easy. So there are two basic types of referencing system. One is the author date or Harvard system. So the first one, if you see the example you see, that's a Harvard system. So here in the text also you write the author and date. So in this one it will come like Praharaj, let's say 2015, Praharaj et al. 2015. Or the second one is a Vancouver system, which is more like a number system. No? So you can have number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as it appears in the text. So there are subtle differences in, so I'll not go into details. You can actually check. There are many sources to how to write, let's say for journal, for book entries, or for other things. Other things that you need to keep in mind is permissions. Many times you are using some scales, you need to take permissions, you need to write to the authors, email them early because it takes a lot of time to get replies. And many ethics committees actually very strict on getting permissions for scales. Some scales will require translation and validation. I'll tell a little bit more about that. Seek a statistical consultation early. Even they can tell you about the study design, whether it is right, wrong. So this is important. So scale translation actually involves a lot of things. Actually, you need to translate, back translate. So there are translation, back translation is one method. And you can also use a consensus approach, or you can use both, combination of both. So, so one person translates and then another person back translates, and then one person actually compares the original versions and see whether it has the same meaning. So main thing that you need to understand is it's not a literal translation. The meaning should be retained. So actually that can only be done by an expert in the field. Okay, so if you give it to someone for translation who doesn't have any idea about psychiatry, they will not be able to understand the actual meaning of the terms, how it is. So it's not a literal translation. So that is something that you need to keep in mind. Second thing is you should always pre-test it on some individuals. Ask the patients, would-be patients, and do a whether they're able to understand it and then they're able to respond it properly. So that would, so once you do that, then maybe you can do some validation exercise. So scale translation takes time, and if you do it well, you can publish this one as a separate paper as well. You should be using the standard guidelines, the reporting guidelines which are there. If you see Equator network, so you'll see all these guidelines for randomized trials, CONSORT guideline, observational studies, STROBE guideline. There is a specific guideline for study protocols, what we call SPIRIT guidelines. This is mainly for intervention studies, but then it can be adapted for other designs also. So it's a good idea to go through these standard guidelines. A lot of text is there, if you can understand, which will help you understand. So there are explanations for the terms and how to go about it. So this will help you write a really good protocol. The other thing that you should always do is in writing a protocol, you have a timeline. So this is the timeline that I prepared for one of my research. So if you see, so May to next April, 1 year time. So I've written so different things, literature review, which month to which month I'll do, permission for rating scales, protocol approvals, like that. So this is called a Gantt chart. It's a nice this one reminder. You can put it on top of your table so that it reminds you, okay, what all things you have achieved. Don't forget to do a plagiarism check, because it's very easy to copy paste from papers and then without corrections. And then nowadays the universities are also very strict, and you also learn the habit of, let's say, writing in your own words. So do a plagiarism check. So Turnitin is one software. There are many other softwares which are available, and you can check in your institute, they may be having one. And always run your protocol before you submit. And this is very important for PhD studies, because PhD you should do a thorough plagiarism check before you submit for registration. Ethics approval is the next thing. So you usually send your protocol to a scientific committee, they scrutinize, they will give suggestions. You can send to then the ethics committee. Sometimes both the bodies are same. If you don't have an institutional ethics committee, you can approach an independent ethics committee. This is for, let's say, someone who is into private practice and then want to do a research. Maybe you can approach an independent ethics committee. So there are many ethics guidelines that you need to be aware about. So one example is Good Clinical Practice Guideline, ICMR ethics guideline. There are, if you're using a device, there are device rules and regulations guidelines. So all these things are there which you need to be aware about, because you need to follow them. The next thing is, let's say if you're doing an intervention study, it is mandatory now for the study to be registered in trial registry. So why this is important? So that your protocol is out there, and then anyone wants to check whether you have done it correctly or not, they can go back and check whether you have followed whatever you have planned, you have done it that way, or have you deviated from that. So that's why prospective registration is something which is essential. So CTRI is the Indian one. You can, there are many other, like you have in many other countries, and there is one which is run by WHO also. So either of them is fine. So, but then most of the studies they want to be done in Indian registry. Besides trials, other observational studies also can be registered, and there is an option to do that. It's a good idea too. And many ethics bodies, they actually mandate now registration in trial registries. So I'm just coming to the end of the presentation. So you write a protocol, you improve it step by step. So review it by your supervisors, by your colleagues. Then in the scientific committee, once you discuss, probably they will give more inputs. You'll improve on your protocol then. And of course, ethics committee will give suggestions from ethics point of view. Then, like I said, trial registry, they also make corrections. And maybe if you're writing a grant proposal, there also you need to screen, maybe they would give suggestions. So there are a lot of steps actually, checks which are there, and they will help you actually improve your protocol. And last step that you can also do once you're done with your protocol, you've written your protocol, submitted, why waste it? I mean, you can actually use it to publish a paper also. So actually there are some journals which actually publish protocol papers. Provided your protocol is really good, which is publishable, worthwhile, you should actually look into, there are many journals which accept protocol papers. So again, you'll have to go through the same, let's say, things that you need to go through when you're publishing any other paper. So protocol papers can also be published. So I'll stop here and I'll take any questions or anything if you have. I'll stop sharing so we can have a discussion.
Thank you, sir. It was really a nice presentation. Now I'd invite questions from the participants. Till now, there is no question in the chat box. Oh, okay, one question has come. It is from Abhinav Panwar. Sir, what are the downsides when a study goes beyond the period it was supposed to?
Sorry, can you repeat it again? I am not able to
Yeah.
see the question.
No, because the question has come directly to me.
Okay. Can I just?
Sir, what are the downsides when a study goes beyond the period it was supposed to?
Yes. So as part of thesis, actually, it's all time bound. So it will be very difficult if it is exceeding time. So you'll have to finish in time. Otherwise, there is no problem in the time as such, because your ethics committee allows. You can always do it beyond your study duration. Let's say if you have planned it for 1 year, you can always extend it if you have the time, money, and expertise and everything. So there is no problem if you're exceeding the time in that sense. But yes, as part of your thesis, if you're exceeding, probably some places they don't allow you to sit for exams. So you need to submit 6 months before your final exam. So that is the only problem downside that I can think of. Otherwise, it's okay. I mean, there is no problem, because ultimately, rather than stopping it in between, if you complete the study, that is more ethical rather than stopping a study in between. I hope that that answered your question, or?
Yeah. Then there is another question from Devika.
Yeah.
How can we find an independent ethics committee for approval? Any national or state committee?
Yeah, so basically the ethics committee should be there, which is available locally. So it is very difficult to have a, let's say, national ethics committee. Will have difficulties. The main idea is to monitor the study. So ethics committee has that mandate basically to actually monitor your study, the study progress. When you are, let's say, whatever data that you have collected, whether it is a genuine data, whether you are having any problems, whether there are any ethical violations. So those are the things that ethics committee monitors. So if it is situated in some place which is far away, it will be very difficult for them to actually monitor the study progress. So essentially, when we talk about ethics committee, independent ethics committee, it's because it's not there in the institute. So a local ethics committee, if it is available, so that should be the ideal one. But I understand, I mean, we have, I think, something like IPS ethics committee also. But I can see the practical problems that will happen with such ethics committees, because they will not be able to regulate or actually able to identify if there are any ethical violations. So it may be very difficult for them to actually monitor that way. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
I cannot see any more question. Yeah, there is another from Sapna Buddha Nayak from Nimhans. Sir, is it mandatory to register investigational studies? For example, evaluating the effects of anodal DLPFC TDCS on P300 for attention test. Can we register our trial after pilot or before?
No, it's any interventional study in which your focus is intervention. So so you should register because it's mandated, because most of the journals will not accept for publication nowadays. So that is one of the major reason why you should be registering. Second thing is the registration has to be prospective. It means before you start any data collection, it should be registered. Nowadays, I mean, I think after 2018, CTRI doesn't allow any retrospective registration. So you cannot register your study once you start data collection. Even actually, pilot is something which is slightly different, because it is understood by people in different ways. So if you are, let's say, looking at, let's say, whether you will be able to collect, let's say, P300 data in your lab, and you want to check whether I'll just try out 2-3 patients so that I'm getting proper P300. So that is a kind of pilot which you don't publish. Okay, you should not be publishing your pilot studies. Actually, ideally, that is how it is. But many people understand it in different way. They say, okay, first 5 patients I'll take as pilot, and then I'll publish that one as a separate paper. So if you're planning to publish your paper, it's better to register your protocol before that. But if you just want to see whether you are able to do something in your lab, and for that reason, if you're doing a pilot, then it's okay. Then there is no need for registration before that, because you're just seeing more like a feasibility. You're, let's say, a particular thing is feasible in your lab or not. So, but then you shouldn't be going to publish your pilot. So I hope that clarifies.
I cannot see any more questions. So we'll wait for 2 or 3 minutes. Let's see. If
Yeah,
there is no other question, then we will wind up.
fine. If anyone has to tell also, I mean, share their experiences. I see.
Yeah, they can unmute.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
can
they can
share your
unmute
experiences also. I mean, I
and they
think
can talk.
all of us have gone through writing a protocol, so we can share your experiences also.
Maybe I'll ask Manesh question or maybe a suggestion. Basically, many of the institutional ethics committees, like what we had in CIP, the ethics committee, or basically would also double up as a scientific review committee. So, what is the scenario? Because you have taken exams and you have been attached with so many other institutes. What is the current recommendation actually, if you go by NMC or anything, do they have to be separate committees, one being ethical and another being scientific review, or institutes can carry on with their usual mode that the same committee doubles up as both? Because many times, even in IPS also, you don't see the ethical committee doing much hair splitting about the methodological issues and all that. They'll just see the ethical issues and pass the protocol.
Yeah, no, actually, it is the responsibility of the ethics committee to look into all the aspects, even the scientific aspect. So if it has not been scrutinized properly by a separate scientific committee, so ethics committee has that dual responsibility to look at the scientific aspect as well as the ethical aspect, because sometimes the scientific aspect also become part of ethical aspect. Let's say if you are doing a wrong study design altogether. So even if it has been passed by, let's say, a scientific committee, the ethics committee identifies that there is a problem with the study design, they are actually supposed to identify that and they're supposed to correct it, because otherwise it becomes a ethical violation. So the final body would be always the ethics committee, but if you see a scenario in which the ethics committee is having a lot of applications, lot of submissions, it becomes very difficult for the ethics committee to do both the work. So in those scenarios, many of the institutions, they have come up with, let's say, scientific committee, or there are departmental committees, then followed by institutional scientific committees. So there are many layers of filter, no, which you can go through, and you can improvise your protocol. So that is the idea. So, but the actual responsibility falls on the ethics committee, and they should have expert as part of. So if, let's say, the members of the ethics committee, if they don't have expertise in a particular evaluating a particular study protocol, they're supposed to identify an expert and take their input
Okay.
for the scientific aspect as well. If they don't understand, if they have little doubt about that, they should always ask for it.
Okay. There are 3 more questions that have come up. One has come from our Bhavesh Lakdawala sir. He has written, describe in little detail, please mention different design methods that will be helpful for the students.
Yes, different study designs actually is very important, because when you are writing your protocol, so initially starting with, let's say, whether it is a qualitative study or a quantitative study or a mixed design. So depending on that, that's the first thing. So qualitative, again, there are many different methods that different approaches that can be used. So you need to be specific about that. In quantitative study designs, you need to specify whether it is a descriptive or an analytical kind. And in analytical kind, you can have a, let's say, observational study or an interventional study. Interventional, you can have a, let's say, a controlled kind of design, or randomized controlled kind of design, or you can have a non-randomized design, or maybe you can have quasi-experimental kind of pre-post kind of design. In observational study, we divide them into 3 major categories. One is a cross-sectional study, which is when you are seeing exposure and outcome at the same time. Or you can have a cohort design in which you start with the exposure and then move on to identify the outcome. Or you can have a case control design in which you start with the outcome and then go back to the exposure. So these are the 3 basic designs. A very good source for this one, very simple way to identify this is if you read those 2 guidelines that I suggested. One is CONSORT guidelines, one is a STROBE guideline. So all students, I would suggest that that's something you should always go back to those guidelines and see whether you have actually written all the steps, all the things that are mentioned in the guideline, at least most of the things, most of the important things. So there are checklists which are there. So you'll not miss out any information that way if you're using those guidelines. So that is one suggestion that I can give to all students, and maybe all teachers who can actually pass on the same thing to their students.
Okay. And there is a question from Mahesh from Barodra. Is there any source for rating scales and their translated versions, website or book?
Yeah, there are many compendiums for let's say rating scales. So previously, when we didn't have everything online, so there are compendiums which were published. So you can have access to those. So which lists periodically, they list all the let's say scales and their versions, and those details information will be there. And nowadays, because with access, internet access, you can actually virtually look into most of the scales. One thing that you need to remember is there will be 2 basic kind of scales. One is which is copyrighted, the other one which will be in public domain. So all the copyrighted scales, if you go to the copyright holder, so let's say it will be mostly a company, and I think many of the common scales that we use are actually now copyrighted by MAPI Trust. So if you go to their website, you'll actually find all the details, all the versions and all the information there. So that is one. The second is the scales which are there in public domain. So if you find the source of that particular scale, if it is there in a website, usually they would mention all the different versions, even the translated versions. The other thing that you can do if you don't find any of these things is write to the author the main author and ask about it. Usually they keep track of their own scales, what translations have happened, and usually they, in collaboration with the copyright holders, they will tell you what versions are available. Let's say you want a Hindi version of a particular scale and you don't know, you're not sure whether it is there or not there. Write to the original authors. Usually they'll be able to tell you whether there is a Hindi version already available. Because this is important. Why? Because many times you will spend time translating and validating only to find that there was another scale which was there, but then you didn't look for it. So, I mean, all your efforts are actually in vain. So that way, unless the first scale was really bad. So maybe that then it's a good idea to go for retranslation. Okay, so always ask the authors or the copyright owners. They will always be able to tell you about translated versions.
Okay. There is another question by Kumar Gaurav. Can we connect all PG training of psychiatry on a platform to know what the thesis topics are being undertaken in India?
Yeah, good idea. I think the people who are organizing are better suited to
Yeah.
answer that. They can actually do. I think, yeah, Dr. Dhruv Jyoti, he will be able to help you in that. So, yeah, it's a very good idea. Only that I don't know if someone is worried about their ideas being stolen. Otherwise, it's a very good idea.
Yeah. Then probably this is the last question, I believe, from Manik Singh. When you are doing a multicentric study, how do you decide who to approach in terms of ethical clearance, any of the participating institution or a neutral ethics committee?
Yeah, so if it is a multi-site interventional study, then ideally, let's say the 10 sites, the ethics approval should be obtained by all the sites. So the primary person who is the primary investigator, who is in charge of the whole team, usually takes ethics approval first. And based on his ethics approval, if it is from a reliable place, other ethics committees usually will give approvals quite easily based on the previous ethics approval. But it is mandatory for all the ethics committees in the local sites to give approvals. Why? Because like I said, the main reason for the ethics approval is basically they should be able to monitor what is being done in their place. So if you're just waiting for, let's say, approval is obtained in another center, they will not be able to monitor in the other centers. So it's always it's mandatory actually. So you'll have to take. But let's say if you are thinking about a observational study in which you are doing a survey, let's say if you are doing an internet survey and there are 10 centers, 10 sites, 10 investigators from different colleges, I think it is okay to take permission from one center, the primary center, because anyway, no one is going to monitor what kind of who is going to respond, because you're sending, let's say, survey links in mail or WhatsApp to people all over India. So then there is no point having multiple ethics approvals there. So it depends on the study design. So what kind of design? So we need to have single approval or multiple approvals.
Okay. Yeah. So I think there is no more question. I cannot check in the chat box. So I think we will be winding up this session. So I, on behalf of the PG Updation Subspecialty of IPS, I would like to thank the speaker, Samir Paharaja, for his excellent deliveries. My whole team consisting of Dr. Sahul Amin, Sintan, and Sujitda, we'd like to extend our gratitude to all the teachers who have been present here, as well as one special name that I need to mention, that is Gurinder Bir Singh, for taking up the pain at the last moment, because I had called him up on Sunday, probably in the evening, to take up this job of introducing the speaker. Thank you, Gurinder Bir. Then,
Thank you, sir.
I would like to thank each and everyone who is present today. our PGTs, some of the faculties who have attended this. And last but not the least, I would like to thank Team Torrent for the technical support. Thank you all. We'll meet again on the next Tuesday at around 7 p.m. with another topic. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all.
Thank you.